everyone. It's great to be here on the School Leadership Show, although this time we are missing Mike Dowdy. Hope you're doing well, and I hope we can have as good of a conversation without you. Probably not. But here today with me are the authors of Trauma-Sensitive Leadership, Creating a Safe and Predictable School Environment. And I have John Eller and Tom here today. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks for having us, Jen.
Great. And look, I already said us, and it's just me. So I'm going to say us a few times, and you'll know Mike's here in spirit. So anyway, I summarized your book for the main idea, and I think it is just the perfect book for school leaders around the country, around the globe to read right now. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit to why did you write this book now and why school leaders should be reading it now?
It's really interesting. If anything, this time of the pandemic has only heightened the awareness. But John and I have gone to great lengths to explain to people, we didn't just write it as a response to. We started thinking about the book long before anyone was muttering the words pandemic or Zoom or some of the other things, because we felt that this was largely an underserved area. The data sets that are there that emerge that talk about, 1 in 6 children currently in a classroom experiencing a severe stressor, that 2/3 of kids will have gone through. Today, someone shared an article with me that said it might be as high as 90% of all kids who have gone through. So, it got highlighted during the pandemic for certain that we were woefully inadequate in our response. Our responses tended to look like, oh, you know what? Jen lost her grandfather. Let's all close the circle around Jen for a week and, treat her with kindness. And wonderful, was a great approach but it undermined the fact that so many of our kids were experiencing this. So many of our colleagues were experiencing this. And so we embarked on this notion of having a much more holistic approach. Came up against the notion, of course, of I'm an educator. I don't necessarily have the tools. I'm not sure I'm into all of that aspect. And so we tried to take it from a perspective, both of us being long-term educators, of how we might make this tangible for our colleagues so that we could begin the heavy lifting that we think every school district, and I love what you said, around the globe, will take up the charge and become more trauma sensitive, more trauma informed.
And as Tom and I had worked together on other projects in the past, this is the first book we've done together. Actually, Trauma Sensitive Instruction was our very first. But we were looking at some of our topics, and they really fit together into this whole area of trauma sensitive instruction. And you probably, if you've read the book, you probably know Tom and I both grew up in homes that were trauma impacted. And we've both been school leaders, and this was an area that we'd seen for years, that many students were coming from homes where maybe there was conflict and alcoholism and things like that. And as Tom said, educators never really felt that they had the tools. So it's kind of the culmination of the work that both of us have been doing for years, came together on this particular project.
Yeah, I did note that. I thought that, the two of you are certainly uniquely qualified, both having grown up in those trauma impacted environments and having been school leaders. You really brought a lot to this book. And, like you said, Tom, it isn't just a we're still dealing with, despite what the president said, we're still dealing with the pandemic response. But everything you wrote in the book, I taught over 20 years ago, but I could relate to, or I could think back to certain students in my classrooms, even back then. Would you mind telling the listeners a little bit about the ACE study and what that brought to light for many people?
Sure. In the mid-1980s, Kaiser Permanente had commissioned a study that was done. And basically, they looked at, I think, around 40,000, what they thought were kind of well-adjusted middle-income people. And what they did was they took a look at their health histories, and then they asked them to complete an ACEs survey, which asked them to respond to 10 kind of very common traumatic experiences. And what they found was at least 25% of those people had at least one ACE, and up to 50% of them had had 4 or more. So this was kind of the pivotal study that really raised awareness around this whole idea of what are ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences.
And then subsequent to that, the study's been replicated because, again, the time of the initial study was largely a middle class, largely a white population. So it's been replicated in a number of other constructs, different environments, looking at an African-American population construct, looking at larger city centers. And the data sets hold true time and again. And, as an educator, and most of your listeners who are educators will understand this, that the impact doesn't just reside with the one individual, right? We see the same thing in Canada, where I'm coming from. We're doing a lot of work with our Indigenous folks and on a truth and reconciliation journey about the impact of residential schools. That impacted those children as adults, their inability to parent. Well, you can imagine then, if you grew up in a trauma-filled environment, and by the way, let's be clear, it's not a death sentence, right? It does mean that you've got to do some work, but it is possible to overcome even if you've had 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. But we have to be aware that that impacts that group of adults who are now parenting children, and those children are coming to school perhaps not prepared to have the type of resilience to overcome some of these adverse experiences.
I think that is something that's different from now. I think back when I was in the classroom decades ago, the sense was that trauma was on the periphery. Maybe you're 1 or 2 students. And I think that what this report, reading about this report in your book, the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Report, you realize just how prevalent this is. And then, of course, now you have to lop on top of that a lot of the impact of COVID-19, of course. So I think the prevalence of it, and then also the long-term impact. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what we have learned more recently about the impact of trauma on the brain, and why this is important for those of us who work in schools.
Yeah, the most essential piece is for people to understand that trauma is very unique. Trauma is very personal. So what might be traumatizing for me could be something that for John, it just rolls right off and it doesn't have the impact. That doesn't make it right or wrong, right? So we have to understand that if a child has experienced something traumatic and they leave house and come to school in the morning, what ends up happening in the brain, the most important, significant piece for people is to understand that this trauma, this fear-inducing event, stimulates the amygdala. The amygdala releases cortisol. Once cortisol is in the body, all learning stops. It doesn't matter how magnificent you are. It doesn't matter how awesome your lesson is. It doesn't matter how wonderfully well you greeted that kid. That child is unable to learn. Their cognitive processing has gone offline. Their ability to emotionally regulate has gone offline. And until the body metabolizes that cortisol, takes 2 to 3 hours, by the way, that child is in a state of dysregulation. Now, usually after about 20 to 30 minutes, we may be able to make some gains. So, what we have to always encourage our colleagues is to not take this personally, but to understand that maybe there's something else going on. That maybe when John arrives to school today, he looks a little more out of sorts than he might typically be his happy-go-lucky self. And that it's not about now trying to consequence John to better behavior, to have a more appropriate response, because that's just going to be more trauma-inducing. He's gone through emotion already. He needs calmness and stability in order to calm himself down and get to a state where he can begin to process.
As Tom and I work with educators across North America, people are really surprised and appalled by the biological part of this whole adverse childhood experience. Some children are able to develop coping skills, which we call resilience. They're able to kind of put this off and maintain composure where others aren't. And a really scary fact of this is that the younger the child is experiencing these traumatic events, the less likely they are able to control them. So, for example, as adults, if we're exposed to something traumatic, we learn how to control our brain so that we can not react. But as children, especially younger children, preschoolers, what happens is this becomes a regular part of their practice as their brain is forming. It starts to develop this kind of predisposition for reaction. And we talk a little bit about the biological part of this when we work with educators. It's interesting because the cortisol, it's a natural human reaction that's supposed to protect us in times of physical, threat. So the blood supply of the brain is actually focused on the center core part of the brain, which some people know as a reptilian brain, which only can react. So when children have multiple adverse events, or when they have events that happen all the time, this becomes a regular part of the reaction. So a teacher might have a student and they might say good morning, and one student is experiencing trauma and they're completely relaxed, and another one can be totally set off. So back to Tom's comment, as educators, we have to learn not to take it personally, not to have our own adverse reaction when something appalling happens. And then think about not to investigate, but maybe understand that, hey, I need to step away for a moment, or I need to let the child re-regulate themselves. So again, as adults, we have to be careful, because and many educators also have had these adverse experiences. If we either are too, maybe, I don't want to say too kind, but if we're too accommodating and we lower our expectations, that can be harmful, as well as if we say, well, I made it, so, you got to just toughen up. So as educators, we have to think about how we react.
Yeah, that's something you emphasize in the book, that with such a large percentage of people in the general population who've been impacted by trauma, that includes our teachers, our staff members as well.
Yeah.
And I want to go back to one word that you use, John, which is understand. And I think that what I took from your book is that there's sort of two parts. As educators, we need to better understand, the brain science that you're talking about, the reactivity that is not because of something I did, Jen. It's not because my lesson plan wasn't engaging enough. It's really separate from me. So the understand, and then the strategies. That's sort of how I saw as the two big takeaways from the book. But I'm wondering, as people are listening to this, educators, specifically leaders, and maybe some teachers too, how do you deal with the pushback that you get when educators say, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor, I'm a teacher, right? I'm a principal. Like, why is this my responsibility? This is too big for me to touch. I've already got enough going on. How do you respond to that pushback?
We kind of address that because we don't really talk about remedies or reactions. We really focus on a concept called mindset. And if you have a mindset that this could be occurring, and that it's almost a natural part of the process a person would react, you're going to step back a moment and try to really understand what's happening, not that you have to fix the problem. So the mindset of understanding, that's what we're hoping people will gain. Many of us don't have the skills to counsel or to work someone through a situation, but we do have the skill to stop making a reactionary decision, develop the mindset that lets us sit back and understand.
So what we do have, and just to follow up on that is the ability to not re-traumatize. And by the way, I don't always mean that people do that intentionally, right? Sometimes it's in these practices. We asked Jen to go to the board to solve the math problem. There may be some stuff there that doesn't work for her. There may be a bit of self-consciousness already developed as a result of experiences far external to the math room, right? And what are we doing? I think early on in physical education, I think we body shamed a lot of kids by making them all get into that same little gym strip and consequence them if they didn't want to. Is it about physical activity, or is it about, wearing these sorts of things? So that's the first part of it. The second part, I want to go back to a word John used earlier, resilience. See, what we do have the capacity to do in schools to build resilience. Now, I grew up in a time where resilience was thought of as grit. It existed only in certain epic, heroic characters. John Wayne of the silver screen. We all had to be like that. Well, now we know that resilience is a learned opportunity. It requires the presence of one significant adult and multiple opportunities to practice. So John and I have really been pushing for this notion. Is every kid in your school known by name and need? See, that is in our purview as educators. If you're talking about how I deal with the complexities of trauma, you're right. I need to bring in specialists for that. And fortunately, I have that capacity to refer people to specialists. But around the notion of whether or not we are intentionally or inadvertently re-traumatizing, that's our purview. And our ability to build resilience, to cultivate that in every child, is well within the job of an educator.
Another aspect that Tom was talking about is relationships. And we're asking teachers not only to think about their mindset, but about the relationships they build. And as leaders, those are things that we can help people learn how to do. So greeting kids at the door, getting to know more about them. As Tom said, knowing everyone's name. Every student should have an adult that they have a relationship with. But cultivating really sincere relationships, that's another important aspect.
These brief strategies that you've mentioned already sound like they're ones that really benefit everyone, right? I mean, even if you haven't you don't officially fit the definition of trauma, right? Every student should be known. And I've seen schools do a wonderful job of at a staff meeting putting up the names of all the students on sticky notes, and then all adults who have a relationship, put their initial on the sticky notes, and you see who has no adult initials, or who has a lot and who has a few, and there's a lot that you can do with that.
And it's a really interesting activity. And I've done that with a number of schools, because I think sometimes we think there might be these kids we could predict ahead of time. But, oftentimes the kids who are challenging us the most, they got a lot of advocates. But there's this band of kids that are drifting through school right now that we need to address. We need to make sure they are connected. See, I think sometimes people have this impression that someone going through trauma is acting in an overt fashion, that it's easily determined who's going through trauma. When in fact, we know that lots of times there are those kids who choose the hide or the appease response. They nod their heads, they smile, you would never know. They might get upset if they only got 98% on a test because they don't know how they're going to explain that when they get home. It's a different type of trauma. I can tell you that for the longest part of my school career, I certainly did not talk to any teacher, no matter how wonderful they were to me, about what I was experiencing. Absolutely not. It never came, never would have entered the conversation. It's taken me well into my adult life to be able to talk about it openly. And so we know we've got lots of kids who aren't exhibiting crazy behaviors, who are going through very difficult times.
And there are some basic things like providing a space to talk, right, to process. So I'm a very practical minded person. And so I am imagining, school leaders listening to this in their car at the end of the, right. So I'm curious if you can share with all of these school leaders, what are some concrete steps they could take tomorrow? I was particularly moved by, this idea that a student could experience something traumatic at home and the cortisol still going on in their bodies when they get to school. And there was sort of a description of what a school leader might do school-wide to make that transition to school more trauma sensitive. I don't know if you could share some concrete ideas like that from the book.
Sure. One thing that we advocate school leaders do is help their teachers become aware that this is actually happening. And the idea of understanding that what can cause stress, what happens when children are under stress, that's really important because, again, it helps with the reaction. A second thing that we advocate is that the school leaders think about having some routines and rituals that are predictable. And we in the teacher version, we also talk about the classroom should be predictable. many of these students come from situations where they don't know, tonight the car comes home and it could be a completely calm evening, and tomorrow night it could be chaos. So the children really don't have any control over the environment. So setting up those kinds of routines that are common so that kids aren't taken by surprise, those are two pieces that we advocate.
And then we also talk about the notion of setting up a calming space, right? Do you have a classroom, an extra space in the school where kids can just go to get themselves back to a steady state? There may be, they can do, the adult doodling or coloring or whatever. There could be an adult there that's there, but doesn't say the minute the child walks in, so what are you here for? Can we talk? No. The kid will let them know, but it's a calming space. Within a classroom, can we section off a piece of the classroom where kids can just go to begin this process of self-regulating? That's a great skill that we should be nurturing in all of our students. It's a skill we could use as adults so that we don't always get upset in traffic, for example.
We'll always get upset in traffic, but it's not that complicated, right? To be able to set up a space, you do need to staff it. You don't want to leave kids alone. Yeah. I love the example in the book about in the morning, a principal who is playing music or even making that change. How many of you run schools where until the exact start time, 7:55, 8:15, the kids have to stay outside, right? Mm-hmm. What if you paid a few teachers to come in earlier? Let them come inside, right? That's a more welcoming stance, right? Maybe they have some homework that for other reasons they couldn't do at home, they could catch up, or the relationships you talked about. If it's the same consistent 2 teachers every morning, maybe those students learn and look forward to connecting with those teachers.
We at the middle school I was at, Jen, we had some kids that arrived early to hang out with our custodian. Mm-hmm. He had great relationships with kids. There were kids who wanted to be the next school custodian. They were fascinated by his routines in the morning. Yeah. The school was open.
Yeah, right? And that might be the first adult that they, really connect with for the day or at all.
Right.
Another school-wide procedure that I really liked was changing the attendance procedure. So it's not just present, not present, but that the kids would all do some type of emotion or mood meter. And if students checked off either I need time for myself or I'm not ready for learning, if they checked that off twice during the week, that sort of was a red flag, and then they could get sent to a counselor. And that seems like a very preventative thing rather than waiting for 6th period. That kid wasn't ready for learning 1st period. So now 6th period, you're dealing with the fallout of that. But if somebody puts that in, if a student puts that in first thing in the morning, how wonderful a way to say, like, we could go to this room that you talked about to take a little space.
We know this. Look, if you can predict it, you can prevent it. Right. So let's not turn off our observational skills. Teachers are great at this. Principals are great at this. Noticing kids who come in on Monday morning wearing the same clothes they wore home Friday afternoon. It's easy to suggest that perhaps that kid didn't have the greatest weekend. So now what do we need to do? I've worked in some schools where the principals are out greeting the buses. Talk about setting the tone, right? When I was a district leader, I'd share with the principals all the time, I shouldn't be able to phone the school and have your secretary say, yep, she's right here, he's right here. That was more of a concern for me than, they're out of the office. Can we get them to call you back later? That's what I wanted to hear.
And Jen, we're alluding to things that are emotionally based. And one thing that a school leader can do is actually help the teachers understand the importance of self-care. Because if we take care of ourselves, we're better able to take care of the students. And when Tom and I work with leaders, we talk about the fact that sometimes as leaders, we're the worst ones for self-care. And we say, go home, be with your family or take off for a doctor's appointment. But then we're the ones staying there. So the leaders need to think about self-care and then make it a part of the teacher's life, because that sets the emotional tone. When people are more healthy, they can actually react differently.
And I think it goes beyond self-care. I think it's the idea of modeling trauma-sensitive practices, right? Mm-hmm. So self-care is one of them. If a student or a staff member comes screaming at the leader, to be able to model pausing and not being reactive, being calm and letting the person have some time to calm down. You know, if you want to create a trauma sensitive school, I liked all of your examples of how the leader can model that with the students and with the staff, right? If you want your students to feel they have a sense of belonging, then as a leader, can you make your staff feel a sense of belonging? If you want every student to be known, not just as a math student, but, you know, as a whole student with needs and wants, you know, do you know something about all of your teachers and all of your staff members? So I think there's a lot that we can do as role models too. So I like, you know, some of your descriptions, and I want to keep an eye on the time of the, you know, like what is a trauma sensitive classroom versus a more traditional classroom, or a trauma sensitive school? Can you help versus a traditional school? Can you help our listeners visualize, like, what would it mean, you know, if the two of you walk into a school tomorrow and, oh, this is a trauma sensitive school. Oh, walk into this classroom. This is a trauma sensitive classroom. What are some of those attributes?
Well, I think the fact that people have an awareness that trauma exists, and then they take those steps to build relationships. So in a school, you're going to see teachers who are up and walking around, greeting kids at the door, maybe visiting with students in the hallway. As Tom said, leaders are out in the morning, teachers are out in the morning when kids are being dropped off or they're walking to school, setting that tone. The idea that because they have an awareness, they develop some common processes and procedures so that every place that child goes, they have similar kinds of experiences. So again, it's not shifting gears back and forth. Friendly, outgoing staff. And I think kids who feel comfortable, you know, sitting in rows maybe is great for organization, but it doesn't always work for every teaching style. So kids in groups, a lot of schools start off with morning meetings where kids can actually talk about how they're feeling and how they're going to work, you know, how they're going to focus on the day to be successful. I think it's going to be much more flexible than regimented.
Yeah. You know, and that last part's critical. You know, listen, we've all worked in schools where a lot of this stuff gets housed in prepackaged lessons. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment those are terrible, but they are a tool, right? But we have a theme week on empathy, and that's it. That's the only time we talk about it. We schedule advisory periods Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 o'clock, as if every kid can keep track of their crises until those moments only. So in a trauma sensitive, trauma aware school, we might see that although we had a brilliant lesson plan today, the teacher senses that 3 kids are walking in a state of discord. And so rather than launching the lesson, we instead get into a circle and we process through some things. We spend time talking about how people had, you know, what their weekend went like. Maybe it's a long weekend, and we know for some of our kids, that's a bit too much time. You know, we begin to develop the language, the vocabulary that is essential for kids to recognize in self and in others these key attributes, right? About being compassionate, about being aware, about being sensitive to. So we start to see some more of that. You know, the emphasis on relationship building is there not only beginning of the year, but throughout the year. That we know there are key times during the school year where there are spikes in misbehavior. And it's equally important that we recognize as adults, we also took our foot off the gas a little bit because we're also excited about Christmas coming up. We're also looking forward to summer break, right? So in trauma sensitive schools and trauma aware schools, there's an anticipation of those times, and we almost preempt them. We almost do a booster shot to remind everybody. Look, February is the shortest month on the calendar. It's the longest month in any school year, right? We have juice to get us through from Christmas through January, but then it's colder, it's darker. You know, there's no holidays till forever. Why is Easter so late this year? And on it goes. Well, again, we anticipate these things, right? They structure the school. They're collecting positive evidence as much as they're collecting negative evidence.
Tom talked about this earlier, and I really want to come back and emphasize this point about teachers supporting students and learning how to regulate themselves. So in a trauma-sensitive, trauma-informed school, you're going to see, instead of classroom management, quote, discipline being punitive, rule-based, it's going to be, we're going to teach the students the skills they need to be successful. So you're going to see teachers teaching kids how to deregulate, or how to regulate themselves, how to de-escalate conflict, how to deal with conflict. I've seen schools where students are actually conflict managers. When two students are in a heated conversation, a student can come up and help coach them down. You'll see teachers teaching the procedures and practicing the procedures and affirming the students who are being successful. So again, we're developing the whole child, we're developing these processes, but it also helps us to avoid the issues of striking out, anger, that sort of thing.
I mean, these sound like wonderful places to be. This sounds like a kind of school I would want to work in. I would want to send my children to. These sound like these are people-forward schools. These are student-centered schools, right? Centering the students instead of centering some idea of order, structure, or even academics at the exclusion of looking at students as full people who have emotions and pasts and futures and all of that. So this all sounds like a positive way to structure your school for any and all students. Did you want to add?
And Jen, this goes back to the mindset. So if your mindset is, we're here to help develop students because they're not learning these kinds of skills outside of school, that's different than we're here to control, keep everyone in line, and I'm the biggest person in the room, so I'm the boss. Yeah. The mindset, it sounds simple, and it could be simple to change. The idea of what am I here to do? I'm here to facilitate and help them become, responsible adults. So over time, you think about taking out the power of it, the power of size and position, and you really focus on the development of it, which again, Tom talked about this, like, it's really difficult when a student is, upset to not take it personally. But if you have the mindset that it's not about me, they didn't come to school today to get me, I'm the only person they feel safe with, so maybe they strike out. So if you take it personally, then you're gonna try to get into a power struggle, and you end up nobody wins. But if you look at it like it's not about me, it's about the student, then you approach it differently. So the mindset is really key.
Yeah, it's really interesting in the sense that, I think people sometimes forget that school is a 13-year experience. It's not 13 10-month experiences. And I've been doing a really interesting exercise with colleagues of late. I've said, okay, so tell me what attributes you want every young woman and man to have at the end of that 13-year experience. And I will hear all the things you might expect to hear: confidence, self-reliance, empowered, a nice person, responsible, caring, trusting, and the list will just go on and on. I've done it hundreds of times. I've got the same list almost every time. What never appears on the list is knows the quadratic formula, can conjugate verbs, mastered the left-hand layup, etc. If I ask people by a grade level or a content area, what do you want kids to have? It immediately defaults to learning targets. We all know what we expect at the end of this 13-year experience we're called school. That's the focus. The content, the course, the grade level is the vehicle to get to these attributes that we would all agree would define a successful and awesome young woman or man transitioning to the next stage of their lives. In trauma-sensitive environments, we're focused more on that end product, not the temporary of somebody struggling with grade 3 math.
Well, that seems like Oh, go ahead, John.
By the way, I've worked for a number of years helping teachers get a master's in teacher leadership. And I did an activity similar to Tom, except I said, tell me, what were your greatest memories from your 13-year experience of being a student yourself? Almost all of the memories were emotional, relationship, things they learned from teachers. There was almost nothing related to content.
Yeah.
So of course, as we're talking with a group of teachers, we have to think about, what does that mean? You as an educator yourself, it wasn't the content, it was the relationship and what you learned about that teacher from the personal standpoint that was much more meaningful.
So I think a final important takeaway for leaders, given what you both said, is first of all, those are two great activities that leaders could do. Have your teachers list the 13 years and what they take away and remembered from their kindergarten, first grade, et cetera, years. And then also, what do you want a graduate of our elementary, middle, high school to look like? Because it's important not for leaders to walk away from this podcast, this book, with a set of strategies. Yes, the strategies, but to start with the mindset. And the way all educators act and how they behave is based on their beliefs. So we have to start with the beliefs, right? If they believe kids are acting out because, they're out to get us, or our lessons aren't engaging enough, they have to work on that mindset first. So it's an adaptive change to change the mindsets of educators. So leaders should come away from this to think about, what are the mindsets that we can discuss and massage, and then what are the strategies? And this book is full of both. So I recommend it to everyone. It is Trauma Sensitive Leadership, Creating a Safe and Predictable Environment. I just had a great conversation with John Eller and Tom Hirk, and they do have a companion book, Trauma Sensitive Instruction, that you could get for your teachers when they want to drill down into some of those strategies. So any final, where people can find you if they want more of your work and your expertise?
I've just got my website, tomhirk.com is probably the safest place. First initial, last name at Gmail, if anyone wants to send a Gmail message.
And same here, I'm jeller3@gmail.com. And I also have a website, Eller and Associates.
Great. Well, thank you to both of you. I'll ask Mike to put those in the show notes. We missed him, but no, really, thank you for your time. This is such important work, and I'm glad that we're getting it out there now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your support.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.